The member for Bradfield.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In making some comments on the bill that is before the House today, I wish to address three principal areas. Firstly, why is radio communications important? Secondly, what is it that this bill does, and what views do we in the opposition have about the provisions of this bill? And thirdly, to what extent does this bill reflect some fundamental tensions and inconsistencies in the views that have been put forward by the Labor government about communications policy? And I'll put to you, Mr Deputy Speaker, that it reflects and reveals a remarkable number of gaping inconsistencies. Let me start, Mr Deputy Speaker, by talking about why radio communications is important. As we've heard from previous speakers, spectrum is a finite resource. And it turns out that this finite resource, radio frequency spectrum, is enormously valuable, both to the society in terms of providing very useful services, and secondly, it's of great value to the organisations which obtain the right to use that spectrum to deliver communication services, be it mobile, be it fixed wireless, be it digital television or analogue television, or any other such service. This therefore raises a problem. How ought we efficiently and fairly to allocate the use of radio frequency spectrum, given that it is a vital national resource which is in limited supply, and secondly, given that it presents significant financial benefits to those who are fortunate enough to gain access to that spectrum? Historically, it was allocated by administrative fiat, and as we saw in Australia in the 1950s, or a small number of fortunate companies and individuals were made very well off indeed by being granted television licences. And a similar experience occurred around the world where spectrum was allocated in this administrative fashion. Over time, policymakers began to think that there might be a better way to do it. And as we've heard from a number of speakers here today, Australia, in fact, was at the forefront of a different approach to public policy in the allocation of radio frequency spectrum. Economists began to argue that it would be a good idea to allocate spectrum through the use of auctions, so as to allow spectrum to go to its highest value use, and also allow the community, through government, to capture a share of the economic value of that spectrum through the prices charged to companies which successfully bid for that spectrum. We have had a long series of auctions of spectrum in Australia over the last 15 or 20 years, starting, as we've heard, with the 900 MHz, the allocation of the 900 MHz spectrum for GSM licences, which was not an auction but was part of the opening up of telecommunications to competition in the early 90s. But then we had the 800 MHz spectrum allocated, the 2 GHz spectrum and a whole range of other spectrum used for a range of services today, second and third generation mobile, and also for fixed broadband services, for example in the 2.3 and 3.4 GHz bands. So we have had a public policy process in Australia which has been successful, but it has carried with it the seeds of some problems, because the spectrum licences that were allocated for a term of 15 years. At the time this was done, it was naturally enough thought that 15 years was very distantly in the future, and there wasn't really a necessity to think very carefully about what might need to be done when the 15-year period expired. We are now, of course, facing that expiry. That will start to happen between 2013 and 2017 in relation to spectrum licences currently on issue, and that presents a problem because there is a presumption in the Act that the spectrum will be reallocated by auction. This potentially presents the prospect of very significant public inconvenience if spectrum which is today used by a party which may be serving millions of customers is reallocated through auction. The consequences would be quite complex. Now, of course, weighed up against that are all the good arguments in favour of using auctions. And so, therefore, the essence of this bill is to take an approach to reallocation which allows a range of factors to be considered, and also to give ACMA some additional flexibility in the timing in which it commences a reallocation process. And that is reasonably uncontentious. Which brings me to the second part of what I wanted to talk about, which is what it is this bill does and the Coalition's attitude to that. As I've indicated, the variation in ACMA's powers to give it more flexibility in terms of timing is uncontentious. What is considerably more contentious is the proposal that the power to reallocate, or the reallocation determination issued by the Minister, should no longer be a disallowable instrument. The importance of public policy in this area suggests very strongly that Parliament ought to retain the capacity to oversee the actions of members of the Executive, in this case the Minister for Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy, and so we view with considerable scepticism the proposal that that reallocation determination should no longer be a disallowable instrument. Other aspects of the bill are not so contentious. For example, the proposal that ACMA should have the power to issue class licences over spectrum, which is also the subject of spectrum licences. This recognises developments in technology and the fact that it may now be technologically possible to allocate spectrum to both the holder of a spectrum licence and to other users in a way which does not interfere with the rights of the holder of the spectrum licence. We've seen other examples of the practices in allocating spectrum change over time with technological developments. For example, when analogue television first came into operation in Australia in the 50s, there were 7 MHz guard bands which applied between each allocation of spectrum to a broadcasting licensee. And the reason for that was that with the technology of that time, there was the risk of interference if you simply allocated one block of spectrum and then the immediate next block of spectrum was also allocated. With the introduction of digital television in Australia, we've been able to reuse those bands of spectrum which until now have been lying fallow, because the technology today means that you do not face that same risk of interference. So the fundamental notion of changing the regulatory framework, evolving the regulatory framework by which we allocate spectrum, having regard to the improvements in technology and the capacity now to use spectrum in more flexible ways, is a sensible policy, and it has our support. We do not, as I've indicated, share, though, the government's confidence in the capacity of its minister to make reallocation determinations without being subject to the necessary scrutiny of Parliament. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, the third point I want to touch on is the extent to which this bill reveals, perhaps inadvertently, the fundamentally conflicted attitudes of the Labor Party when it comes to communications policy. The first area of conflict is that we have seen in the approach to the National Broadband Network, Mr Deputy Speaker, a tremendous faith in centralisation, a tremendous faith that government knows best. A government which could not even competently give away pink bats apparently has the knowledge and capacity, Mr Deputy Speaker, mystifyingly, apparently has the knowledge and capacity to build a network bigger and more ambitious than any private sector company has ever built. A network that will go all around Australia using a technology which has never been used for this purpose in Australia, all to be delivered on time and on budget. And wouldn't it be remarkable if we could all share that faith in the capacity of government to do this thing? On this side of the House, Mr Deputy Speaker, we do not share that faith. We continue to believe that the best approach to telecommunications policy is to give primacy to the market, primacy to the competition, and of course that is the philosophy which, interestingly, underlies the whole regime for allocating radio communications spectrum. The whole principle which underlies the approach in the Act, which is amended by this bill, is that you allocate spectrum using a competitive process and it will go to its highest use. And very importantly, Mr Deputy Speaker, spectrum licences are not technology specific. The user of the spectrum is free to use it for the purpose which he or she or it believes will be the most productive use. And we rely upon the auction process to identify who believes they have the highest value use for the spectrum. So if they believe that using it to deliver broadband services over third-generation mobile or over the shortly arriving fourth generation, then it is open to them to put in a high bid and take advantage of the capacity to get that spectrum. So a philosophy which relies upon competition, which relies upon the market, is what underpins our approach to radio communications spectrum allocation. And there is a rich irony, Mr Deputy Speaker, in the fact that this government is putting forward a bill to amend that Act, which is consistent with that philosophy which underlies our approach to allocating radio frequency spectrum, at the same time as they are using a naively centralising approach, a government knows best approach when it comes to the overall question of broadband. But that is not the only area where this bill reveals the fundamentally conflicted attitudes within the Labor Party, because the second thing that is fundamentally revealed to be in conflict, a fundamental degree of confusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, is their attitude to wireless. Because we hear in what Minister Conroy said in a press release earlier this year, wireless spectrum is a valuable public asset. We hear in the second reading speech the minister in this House saying that many of the licences to be allocated under this bill are now used by telecommunications carriers to provide mobile phone and wireless access services to millions of Australians. So a recognition that wireless is an enormously important service of enormous value. We can expect as a nation to raise very significant amounts of money from private sector players when it comes to the reallocation process. And this, I think, is a recognition that all of us could agree with. But regrettably, when it comes to the politics of broadband, all recognition of truth, of fact-based assessment of reality goes out the window, and it all gets down to grubby politics, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is what Stephen Conroy had to say on Lateline on the 18th of August. Criticising the former Shadow Minister Tony Smith, he said he still won't answer you how many people he is going to condemn to a wireless network that can't deliver the services that Australians are increasingly going to need and demand over the coming years. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am confused. What does Minister Conroy believe? Does he believe that wireless is an enormously valuable public asset, that wireless services are of high value in delivering broadband, mobility and other things, or does he believe, when he's engaged in grubby politics, that wireless is something to which Australians are to be condemned? Well, he can't have it both ways, Mr Deputy Speaker. The fact that this bill is being introduced, which highlights the central importance, the vital importance of wireless communications, reveals fundamentally the stark hypocrisy of Stephen Conroy in the approach he took in the last election in putting forward a particular perspective on broadband. And it's very, very disappointing that something as fundamentally important, Mr Deputy Speaker, as telecommunications and broadband policy in this country is being compromised by the grubby political attitude which this present government is bringing to bear. Let me quote from somebody else who's been a significant cheerleader of the government's national broadband program. He gave a speech. He wrote an article. I'm talking about Professor Rod Tucker of the Institute for a Broadband-Enabled Society. He wrote an article which appeared in The Age on August the 10th in which he said, critics claiming wireless is all we'll need are living in the past. Again, part of an attack on wireless for political purposes, which seems to be wholly inconsistent with the central thesis of this bill, with which I might say, Mr Deputy Speaker, we fully agree, which is that wireless is of vital importance. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm sure it would be as evident to you from that brief description of the fundamental inconsistencies and attitudes delivered by the Labor Party, and I might also quote what Senator Conroy said on August the 10th. He said that the Coalition's plan to focus on wireless ignores the advice of industry experts. It will consign Australia to the digital dark ages. Very confusing stuff, Mr Speaker. Is wireless a good thing or a bad thing? Very hard to tell from this Minister Conroy. And if this is the kind of political approach we are seeing to an area of vital public policy, Mr Speaker, is it any wonder that we view with enormous scepticism the proposal that this minister ought to have the power to make a reallocation determination without it being subject to the scrutiny of Parliament? We are very concerned about that, and that is a matter which requires very careful consideration.